In this module, we'll be talking about sexual practices or sexual behaviors. In other words, we'll be discussing what people actually do when they have sex. As we go through the materials in this module, it's important to keep in mind the ways in which social institutions, such as laws, the government, family, religion, and partners, shape the various sexual behaviors that we engage in. The materials in this module will ask you to think about what happens when we vary from expected and accepted sexual behaviors, and to consider the ways in which the sexual behaviors we engage in shape our social relationships across the life course. Applied professor of health sciences Michael Reese was once asked if you could teach people one thing about sexuality, what would it be? Reese replied, "There's no normal when it comes to sexual behaviors. All of us have very diverse desires and needs when it comes to sexuality, and communicating with your partners about those desires and needs is critical." Despite the fact that people in our society rarely talk seriously about what we do sexually, what we like, what turns us on, how we like to have sex, most of us stick to a fairly predictable routine of sexual behaviors and in a fairly predictable and predictably small number of sexual positions. It's not that we're necessarily sexually boring, but rather most of us find some things that are arousing and see no reason to wander from what works. For example, if a routine of coitus, fellatio, and cunnilingus works for us, we see little reason to try anything else. Some scholars have suggested that if we organized sexual behaviors with the most vanilla acts on one end and the kinkiest behaviors on the other, and then examined the most common sexual behaviors, we'd end up with something like a bell curve. The middle of the bell curve of sexual behaviors is where most people would find themselves most of the time. Although it's important to note there are plenty of people who venture away from the center and towards the edges of a particular behavior, and sometimes set up camp there and organize their sexual interactions based on those particular pleasures. The problem with the bell curve analogy is it creates a kind of false dichotomy. It separates the acts in the middle, often coitus, fellatio, and cunnilingus, from those acts that are towards the tail. But the majority of people at some point have explored the edges. For example, it's not that some people like S&M and others don't. In fact, most people at some point have incorporated what would be considered sexual pain into their sexual encounters. This could be rough sex, slapping, pinching, biting, or even grabbing someone's hair. However, most people do tend to wander inadvertently into the edges on occasion and then return back to the center. Therefore, it might be more helpful to think about our sexual behaviors not as a bell curve or an either or dichotomy, but rather as a continuum in which we can move up and down throughout our sexual lives. At different times in our sexual lives, we might spend more time at different parts of the continuum. And this can be impacted by various social forces, including meeting a new partner or something that becomes popular in the media, like when 50 Shades of Grey first came out. In fact, most people move back and forth on this continuum with very little thought. When we do try something different, then we return to whatever's routine, regardless of what that is. What counts as sexual? In other words, what do people actually do when they have sex? This is far more complicated than one might think at first glance. We may tend to think of sexual activity as primarily genital activity, done alone, with a partner, or even in a group. But genital activity alone does not cover the range of bodily pleasures available to most human beings and the wide range of activities that may be defined as sexual. Most people are familiar with coitus, fellatio, cunnilingus, anal sex, masturbation, and abstinence. But there are other sexual behaviors, including outer course, body rubbing, or fetishisms, that many people know less about. Or they know they find them arousing, but do not know the behavior has a name, or that others find similar pleasures. In fact, some scholars have suggested potential sexual practices are limited only by our sexual socialization and imagination. And of course, what's deemed acceptable and appropriate can change across time and culture.